Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Bert Bond and I'm a senior lecturer in the Children's Health and Exercise Research Centre, sometimes called CHIRC, which is an internationally recognised paediatric research department at the University of Exeter. I'm sorry I can't attend the conference today, but thanks to SASP for allowing me to contribute in this manner. Please note my email here at the bottom of the page should you want to email me about any things I'm going to talk about. So I'm presenting the collaborative project between SASP and the University of Exeter, which was concerned with the perceptions around incorporating movement breaks into the classroom of primary schools. So I'd like to start by, thanking SASP for funding this research, particularly Dave Bullock and Jane Knowles. Without this, this work was only possible through that funding, which enabled us to recruit an exceptionally talented young student, Rebecca Chorlton. Actually, this is Becky's MSc by research work, and this was just a real success story across the board. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Craig Williams and Dr. Sarah Denford, my colleagues at the University of Exeter and also Bristol Medical School, and then also the charity Governors for Schools, particularly Matthew Long, who was very supportive of this work and helped us recruit governors for the project later on. Okay, so just some real basic background, just very quickly. Cardiovascular diseases such as heart attacks and strokes, they're the leading cause of mortality and morbidity in the UK. And whilst they don't affect children directly, we know that the underlying disease process starts in early life. So really here, this is just the overt clinical endpoints of chronic, progressive, and often silent disease process known as atherosclerosis. And really now there is good evidence that exposure to cardiovascular disease risk factors in early life will alter your risk of cardiovascular disease in later life. And in short, this is kind of why we care about health promotion in youth. It's to prevent future disease. And because of this evidence base, public health guidelines typically call for children and teenagers to achieve at least 60 minutes of physical activity per day. And schools, communities, parents typically know this and are receptive to that message. However, being physically active is just part of the story when defining someone's movement behavior over 24 hours or indeed over a week. So, for example, as an adult, your guideline physical activity is to achieve 150 minutes of activity per week. And you might do that by playing a football match at the weekend and then a training session during the week. So those two exposures you've met your 150 minutes. But outside of those two exposures, you're perhaps very sedentary. Or, for example, perhaps not so much with teachers, but in other lines of work, people might walk or cycle to work and then spend 8 hours sitting down being very sedentary work, but then walk and cycle home. So they might be hitting their 150 minutes per week, so they might be high active, but they might also be high sedentary. And because of that, there's this sort of third bullet point to the public health guidelines that people tend to forget. And that's this idea of trying to minimize uninterrupted sedentary time. Now, really, I suppose if I was to demonstrate that graphically, what we want is people to be not only high active, but also low sedentary. And remember, you can be both high active and high sedentary. So this is what you want. You want to be in the middle of this Venn diagram here. And we consider that from a paediatric perspective. It's nice to look at data from the International Study of Children, Obesity, Lifestyle and Environment, which has got over 6,000 children enrolled, aged between 9 to 11 years of age, from 12 different countries around the world. And what's really nice about this data actually is it doesn't just include UK children, but the children from the UK in the study were actually from the Avon, Bristol area, so quite close to home for us. And what you can see there is maybe 50% of those children are achieving the recommended physical activity guidelines. But, quite a lot of those guys are actually highly sedentary, and that's a bad thing. So fewer children are actually meeting the sedentary guidelines. And actually, if you look at what would happen in the middle of that Venn diagram, very few children are both high active and low sedentary. So this is kind of a bit more of a concern, and it's kind of people aren't really paying attention to this area, I think. And so we kind of wanted to address this growing concern, particularly around continuous sitting time. And and certainly in primary schools, because 50 to 70% of the time in primary schools might be spent sitting down. Now, also, in addition to sort of promoting cardiometabolic health in children, there is emerging evidence that breaking up sitting time might help re-engage pupils with their learning. So there might be a strong pedagogical reason to do this as well. So we were very much interested in this area, but what we wanted to do was understand the perceptions regarding classroom activity breaks. Because when researchers such as myself go into schools and say, oh, you should do this or you should do that, those kind of interventions typically fail. It's sort of top down. It doesn't really work. We wanted to understand the perceptions of really key stakeholders, so we could write a sustainable intervention that is effective and has longevity. So we kind of want to work with those kind of end users. And what I mean by that is we want to work with both pupils, staff across the school hierarchy, and governors to try and understand these perceptions. So that was kind of what we wanted to do. So again, thanks to SASP, we recruited 34 Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 pupils, and we did a series of focus group sort of interviews, which went really well. And then we had questionnaires and follow-up interviews with 64 primary school staff and 20 primary school governors. And across the board, it was clear that physical activity was highly valued in school, mostly to promote health and well-being of pupils. But many staff also commented on the benefits of physical activity inside of the school to stimulate pupils for learning, and reinforce good behaviour and aid refocusing. And it's this latter point that seems to be very appealing to members of the senior leadership team and to school governors. So can the benefit of activity breaks re-engage the pupils? And by the way, when I say classroom-based activity breaks, that can be something that's completely irrelevant or completely non-educational. Just a 5 minutes of doing something, sporadic activity that doesn't have to have any learning goals attached to it. It could be completely different to the lesson. So and we asked, do you do this in schools? And actually, most staff tend to. Now, we might have a population bias because the sort of staff that do this are perhaps more inclined to get back to us and fill out our survey and questionnaire and have interviews. So we're aware of that. But across the board, staff seem to be doing this quite a lot, and you can see some of the examples of the things that they were doing at the bottom of the screen there. So just under half of our sample identified that activity breaks were either extremely or moderately easy to implement. So, there's an appetite for this, and many people felt that it was quite, achievable. However, 11 responders, so it's 20% of our sample, considered this to be challenging. So given this enthusiasm and the potential for benefit of activity breaks, it was kind of important for us to understand what are the barriers or the perceived barriers to rolling this out. So again, across the board, the key barrier was time. It was very clear that across the teaching continuum, so teaching assistants, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, senior leadership team, and head teachers, that just curriculum time was so highly valued, it was difficult to justify taking time out of that curriculum to do something that wasn't relevant. However, many people reflected that actually it doesn't take that long to do an activity break, and there might be some benefit in doing it. Another sort of key barrier for people that didn't want to do it, or some things that people had noticed that they had done it, was transitioning back to work after the activity, particularly if the class had individuals with sort of independent or individual needs, so the special educational needs students. Perhaps this can be more disruptive, and that would be problematic. So that was something that people reflected on. But we kind of also wanted to understand, well, how could that be avoided from the people that seem to be doing this quite successfully? But there are probably more instances where teachers were coming back to us and saying, actually, the activity break was overwhelmingly positive for the classroom experience. So again, we've got Key Stage 1 teacher, a teaching assistant, and a head teacher saying that if it's delivered in a certain way, actually it can be very beneficial. So that certainly seems to have legs in terms of improving the classroom environment. The pupils themselves, they sort of reflected they felt more motivated after doing some sort of activity. They could think a bit clearer. A really insightful comment at the bottom of the screen there, reflecting on, yes, it does take time out of the lesson, but actually on balance, because I'm better able to refocus afterwards. That time is made up. So that was quite interesting to hear about. In terms of the key barriers for supporting this more widely from governors who were broadly supportive, it was a case of they really wanted to see some evidence that this has some benefit from other schools before they would be willing to sort of really push it in their own school. So evidence with regards to not just health, but probably just classroom environment. And we're trying to fill that gap now. That's something that we'd like to do. In terms of what might work, undeniably, it was just readily available resources. The children as well wanted something that involved sort of music, something that had some sort of activity that could involve some dance. There is going to be a sweet spot there in terms of what's too over engaging, so students are over aroused to transition back to work, but something that involved some music tend to be quite positive. In terms of when, everybody, including the staff and also the head teachers and the senior leadership team, were really happy to back the teacher's judgment about when to do this. So it could be in the middle of a class, or it could be at the beginning of a class if it's Friday afternoon, or it could be, really, it doesn't have to be rolled out at all. It's just whenever the teacher feels like it would be useful to do. So I think there was a widespread support for allowing those decisions to be made by the teacher, which is quite empowering. The pupils didn't mind when these activities happened. Sometimes they said in the afternoon would better, but there was no real consensus from a pupil perspective. And in terms of what works well for the people who are doing this, about 5 minutes seems to be, and the children also agreed, so about 5 minutes seems to be all right. It's not too long, it's not too short. 5 minutes is kind of achievable. So here are our key findings. Now, I'm pretty confident that many of you in the room will think this is pretty obvious, but we need this evidence really to chase down further funding. So now that we have this insight and the researchers, we understand what works well, and we have these contacts about, with regards to staff that are successfully engaging, their class with activity breaks. What we can do now is try and pull that information and come up with some sort of pilot intervention. So the next steps for us would be to get that intervention and to roll it out in some schools and then quantify, is this working? Does this have longevity? Is this accessible? Is it feasible? Do the pupils like it? Is it a barrier to learning? Are the teachers broadly positive? Can we convince more teachers to do it? Can we convince those governors that wanted that evidence base to take this on? And they can have wide implementation of the intervention. So we're very much looking to do that. And I'd also be quite keen to understand the parent perceptions, because again, if they're quite supportive, that might also grease the wheel, because I think there is an opportunity to work in this area. So that's kind of where we're at now. The next steps will certainly require further research funding. So we're looking to apply for research funds. We've put a grant in to try and support this work, but we'd certainly be looking to work with partners in the area. If this sounds like something you'd be willing to support, or your school would like to be involved in, please do drop me a line. But I just wanted to finish by thanking everyone who was involved. Certainly during the pandemic, it was incredibly challenging. So we're very grateful for people's time. And as I started by saying, it was a real success story, and Becky graduated with her Masters by Research fairly recently.